On the morning of November 1, 1755, at approximately 9:40 in the morning local time, while the overwhelming majority of Lisbon's population was attending religious services connected to the All Saints' Day religious holiday, the ground beneath the Portuguese capital began to shake with a violence that exceeded anything within the documented historical memory of the city's inhabitants. The earthquake itself, which seismologists studying the event have subsequently estimated at a magnitude likely between approximately 8.5 and 9.0 on the modern moment magnitude scale. A magnitude estimate derived from careful subsequent analysis of contemporary historical accounts and subsequent geological evidence, given the complete absence of any direct seismographic instrumentation during this historical period, lasted for a documented duration that various contemporary accounts estimated at somewhere between 3.5 and 6 minutes, an extraordinarily long duration for a major earthquake that contemporary observers consistently described in terms reflecting their genuine terror and genuine disorientation at experiencing ground shaking of such unprecedented intensity and such unprecedented duration. The earthquake's immediate structural destruction was catastrophic and widespread, with churches, palaces, and ordinary residential buildings throughout the city collapsing or suffering severe structural damage, including, with particular and historically poignant significance, numerous churches that collapsed directly onto the considerable numbers of worshippers who had gathered within them for All Saints' Day religious observance, a tragic coincidence of timing that historians studying this disaster have repeatedly emphasized as having substantially increased the earthquake's immediate human toll compared to what might have occurred had the earthquake struck at a different time of day or on a different day of the year when fewer people would have been concentrated within these large stone religious structures. In the hours and days that followed this initial earthquake, the city would face two additional and equally catastrophic disasters: a series of tsunami waves that swept up the Tagus River estuary and inundated the lower portions of the city, drowning considerable numbers of people who had fled toward the waterfront in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake itself, seeking what they believed would be safety in open space away from the city's damaged and potentially still collapsing buildings. And a massive fire, ignited by overturned candles, cooking fires, and other ignition sources connected to the earthquake's structural destruction, that subsequently burned largely uncontrolled for approximately 5 days, consuming considerable portions of the city's remaining structures that had survived the earthquake and the tsunami themselves. Tonight we reconstruct this catastrophic combination of disasters in careful detail, examining not only the earthquake's immediate physical destruction and immediate human toll, but also the genuinely significant and genuinely far-reaching philosophical and intellectual consequences that this disaster produced across European intellectual culture, consequences that connected this specific Portuguese catastrophe to some of the central philosophical and theological debates of the entire 18th century European Enlightenment. Lisbon in 1755 occupied a position of considerable wealth, considerable political significance, and considerable architectural and cultural achievement within the broader context of contemporary European cities, a position that makes the scale of the subsequent destruction all the more historically significant when considered against what the city had achieved and what it subsequently lost. The Portuguese Empire, despite having experienced some degree of relative decline from the peak of its 16th and early 17th century global commercial and colonial dominance, remained in 1755 a substantial and genuinely wealthy global trading power, with considerable wealth flowing into Lisbon specifically through the Portuguese Empire's continuing and substantial colonial trade connections, including particularly significant wealth derived from Brazilian gold and diamond mining. Operations that had considerably enriched the Portuguese crown and considerably enriched Lisbon's broader urban economy across the preceding several decades leading up to 1755. This considerable wealth had been invested substantially in Lisbon's architectural and urban development, with the city having developed an extensive collection of churches, palaces, and other significant buildings reflecting both the wealth of the Portuguese crown and church and the wealth of Lisbon's considerable merchant and aristocratic population, creating a city whose architectural and cultural significance was widely recognized across contemporary Europe, making the subsequent catastrophic destruction of this considerable architectural and cultural inheritance, all the more historically and culturally significant when considered against the scale of what had been constructed and accumulated within the city across the preceding decades and centuries. The Portuguese monarchy under King José I, who had ascended to the throne in 1750, maintained Lisbon as the political capital of this considerable global empire, with the royal court and the broader machinery of Portuguese colonial administration concentrated within the city, meaning that the earthquake's catastrophic destruction struck not merely a wealthy commercial city but the actual political and administrative center of an entire global colonial empire, creating governmental and administrative consequences extending considerably beyond the immediate physical destruction that the city itself experienced. This specific combination of considerable contemporary wealth, considerable contemporary political significance, and considerable contemporary architectural and cultural achievement, all concentrated within a single city that the earthquake, tsunami, and fire would subsequently devastate within the span of less than a single week, provides essential context for understanding both the genuine scale of what this disaster destroyed and the genuine reasons why this specific catastrophe attracted such extensive and such sustained contemporary European attention and contemporary European intellectual engagement, well beyond what might be expected for a natural disaster occurring in a more peripheral or less prominent contemporary European city. The geological and seismological context underlying the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, including the broader tectonic setting responsible for this catastrophic seismic event, has been the subject of considerable subsequent scientific research, even as certain specific aspects of this earthquake's precise geological mechanism remain subjects of ongoing scientific investigation and ongoing scientific discussion. The earthquake's epicenter has been estimated by subsequent seismological research, drawing on careful analysis of contemporary historical accounts documenting the earthquake's effects across various locations throughout Portugal, Spain, and North Africa, to have been located somewhere within the Atlantic Ocean off the southwestern coast of the Iberian Peninsula, in a geologically complex region where the African and Eurasian tectonic plates interact through a complex zone of faulting and deformation that continues to generate significant seismic activity into the contemporary period, even as the precise geological mechanism and precise fault structure responsible for generating this specific historical earthquake remains a subject of some continuing scientific discussion among researchers studying this region's complex geological structure. The earthquake's effects were documented across an extraordinarily wide geographic area extending well beyond Portugal itself, with significant structural damage and significant documented ground shaking reported across considerable portions of Spain and North Africa, and with the earthquake's effects, including documented unusual water level fluctuations connected to the earthquake's seismic energy, reported as far away as various locations in Northern Europe and even, according to some contemporary accounts, in certain Caribbean locations, illustrating the earthquake's genuinely substantial magnitude and genuinely extensive geographic reach. The tsunami that the earthquake generated, striking not only Lisbon itself but also various other coastal locations across Portugal, Spain, and North Africa, and documented as reaching considerable wave heights at certain particularly exposed coastal locations, represents a particularly significant and particularly well-documented consequence of this earthquake's substantial magnitude and its specific underlying offshore geological setting, with subsequent oceanographic and seismological research having used the considerable body of surviving contemporary documentary evidence regarding this tsunami's specific timing, specific wave heights, and specific geographic reach to develop increasingly detailed scientific reconstruction of the earthquake's specific underlying seismic source mechanism. This combination of an earthquake of substantial magnitude, an associated and substantially destructive tsunami, and a subsequent catastrophic urban fire occurring within a single concentrated multi-day disaster sequence affecting one of contemporary Europe's most significant cities, makes the 1755 Lisbon earthquake a particularly significant historical case study within the broader scientific field of seismology and natural disaster research, providing researchers with an unusually well documented historical example of this particular and particularly catastrophic combination of compounding natural disaster mechanisms. The immediate human toll and immediate physical destruction that Lisbon experienced as a direct consequence of the earthquake, the subsequent tsunami, and the subsequent fire represents one of the more catastrophic combinations of natural disaster consequences documented within 18th century European historical record, with various historical mortality estimates suggesting that somewhere between 10,000 and as many as 50,000 people died as a direct consequence of this combined disaster sequence, a very considerable range of scholarly uncertainty reflecting the genuine historical and methodological challenges involved in establishing precise mortality figures for a catastrophic disaster of this scale occurring during this particular historical period. The earthquake's initial structural destruction proved catastrophic across virtually the entire city, with contemporary accounts and subsequent historical and archaeological research documenting the collapse or severe structural damage of the overwhelming majority of the city's churches, palaces, and ordinary residential and commercial buildings. Destruction that proved particularly severe within the lower-lying commercial and residential districts closer to the Tagus River, areas that had been constructed, in many cases, on relatively unstable alluvial and reclaimed land that proved particularly susceptible to the kind of severe ground shaking and associated soil liquefaction effects that major earthquakes occurring in this type of geological setting characteristically produce. The subsequent tsunami waves, striking the city within a documented time frame of approximately 30 to 40 minutes following the initial earthquake, drowned considerable numbers of people who had specifically fled toward the open space along the city's waterfront in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake's structural destruction, seeking what they reasonably but, in this specific tragic circumstance, catastrophically mistakenly believed would represent a place of relative safety away from the considerable risk of being struck by falling building debris within the city's damaged and continuing to collapse urban structures, a tragic pattern of disaster response that subsequent natural disaster researchers have specifically studied as an important historical illustration of how reasonable disaster response decisions, based on incomplete information regarding the full and compounding nature of a developing multi-hazard disaster sequence, can sometimes lead disaster survivors directly into a subsequent and equally lethal hazard. The subsequent fire, ignited by numerous individual ignition sources connected to the earthquake's structural destruction, including overturned candles maintained for the All Saints' Day religious observances, cooking fires, and other contemporary domestic and commercial fire sources, subsequently spread largely uncontrolled across considerable portions of the city over the following approximately 5 days, consuming substantial additional portions of the city's remaining structures, including considerable quantities of the city's accumulated commercial goods, considerable portions of its archives and documentary records, and, according to some subsequent historical accounts, additional numbers of trapped survivors who had been unable to escape from partially collapsed buildings before the fire's subsequent arrival, completing this catastrophic sequence of compounding natural and disaster-connected hazards that, together, produced the overall catastrophic mortality and overall catastrophic physical destruction that this documentary has discussed. The governmental and administrative response to this catastrophic disaster, organized and directed primarily through the considerable personal initiative and considerable personal authority of Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the Portuguese statesman subsequently known to history as the Marquis of Pombal, represents one of the more historically significant and most frequently studied examples of organized 18th century disaster response and subsequent urban reconstruction planning. Pombal, serving as a senior minister within the Portuguese royal government at the time of the earthquake, is widely credited by historians with having organized a remarkably rapid and remarkably effective immediate disaster response, including organizing firefighting efforts, organizing the distribution of food and other essential supplies to the considerable surviving population that had lost access to their normal housing and normal food supply sources, and organizing measures to prevent the kind of social disorder, including documented looting and documented opportunistic criminal activity, that frequently accompanies major urban disasters of this catastrophic scale, with Pombal's specific and famously direct response to King Jose I's anguished question regarding what should now be done reportedly being the characteristically decisive instruction to bury the dead and feed the living. A response that historians studying Pombal's subsequent political career have frequently cited as exemplifying the pragmatic and decisive administrative style that would characterize his subsequent decades of dominant influence over Portuguese governmental policy. Beyond this immediate disaster response, Pombal subsequently directed and substantially shaped the considerable subsequent reconstruction of central Lisbon, implementing what historians of urban planning have specifically recognized as one of the more historically significant examples of comprehensive and centrally planned urban reconstruction following a major disaster. With the reconstructed central Lisbon district, subsequently known as the Pombaline district, reflecting this connection to Pombal's direction of its reconstruction, featuring a regular grid street pattern, standardized building heights and standardized building facades, and, significantly, specific architectural and structural design features intended to provide improved earthquake resistance for these reconstructed buildings, including a distinctive timber framing system, subsequently known as the Pombaline cage construction system, specifically designed to provide improved structural flexibility and improved structural resilience during future seismic events. This specific architectural and engineering innovation, representing what many historians of engineering and historians of urban planning have recognized as one of the earlier historically significant examples of deliberately earthquake-resistant building design and deliberately earthquake-resistant urban planning, reflects a genuinely significant practical engineering response to the catastrophic structural failures that the 1755 earthquake had so dramatically demonstrated, with Pombal reportedly having ordered practical structural testing of proposed building designs, including, according to some historical accounts, having troops march in formation around prototype building structures to simulate seismic ground shaking as a practical test of the proposed construction method's structural resilience, illustrating a genuinely empirical and genuinely practical approach to disaster-resistant engineering design that, whatever its precise historical accuracy in every specific detail, reflects the broader and genuinely significant pattern of practical engineering innovation that this catastrophic disaster motivated within the subsequent Portuguese reconstruction effort. The significant philosophical and theological consequences that the Lisbon earthquake produced within broader contemporary European intellectual culture represent perhaps the most historically distinctive and most frequently discussed dimension of this catastrophic disaster's broader historical significance, connecting this specific Portuguese natural disaster to some of the central intellectual debates characterizing the broader 18th century European Enlightenment. The earthquake struck at a particularly significant moment within the broader development of contemporary European philosophical and theological thought, occurring during a period when the philosophical position broadly associated with the German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who had argued in his earlier published philosophical work that the actual existing world, despite containing genuine evil and genuine suffering, nonetheless represented, when considered in its complete totality, the best of all possible worlds that a rational and benevolent divine creator could have chosen to create, had achieved considerable contemporary philosophical influence and considerable contemporary philosophical discussion across European intellectual culture, with this broadly optimistic philosophical and theological position, sometimes referred to by subsequent intellectual historians using the general term philosophical optimism, representing one of the more prominent and more widely discussed contemporary philosophical frameworks for understanding the relationship between divine providence, human suffering, and the broader rational order that many contemporary philosophers argued characterized the natural and moral universe. The Lisbon earthquake's catastrophic and apparently morally arbitrary destruction, striking with particular and historically poignant severity precisely those churches filled with worshippers engaged in pious religious observance on a significant religious holiday, while reportedly sparing According to various contemporary accounts, whose precise accuracy historians have subsequently examined with some scholarly caution, certain less reputable establishments and certain less pious individuals, located within the same general urban area, presented contemporary European intellectuals with what many of them experienced as a genuinely urgent and genuinely difficult philosophical and theological challenge to this broadly optimistic philosophical framework, raising pointed and widely discussed questions regarding how a benevolent and rationally ordered universe, of the kind that philosophical optimism had argued characterized reality, could possibly produce or permit a natural disaster of this catastrophic scale and this apparently arbitrary moral distribution of suffering and death. This specific intellectual challenge that the Lisbon earthquake presented to contemporary philosophical optimism would generate sustained and genuinely significant subsequent philosophical and literary engagement across the following decades, including, most famously and most influentially, the French philosopher Voltaire's explicit and extensive subsequent literary and philosophical engagement with exactly this philosophical challenge, engagement that would eventually produce both Voltaire's immediately following poem specifically addressing the Lisbon disaster and its philosophical implications, and his subsequently published and considerably more famous satirical novel Candide, a work that used its central narrative, following its central characters through a sequence of increasingly absurd and increasingly catastrophic misfortunes, to mount a sustained and deliberately satirical philosophical critique of the kind of unreflective philosophical optimism that Voltaire believed the Lisbon catastrophe had so dramatically and so devastatingly exposed as philosophically inadequate to the genuine and considerable scale of actual human suffering that the natural and historical world periodically produces. Voltaire's specific and sustained literary and philosophical engagement with the Lisbon earthquake's broader philosophical implications represents one of the more historically significant and most extensively studied examples of how a major historical natural disaster can directly motivate and directly shape subsequent major literary and philosophical production. Voltaire's poem specifically addressing the Lisbon earthquake, published within months of the disaster itself under the title poem Sur le désastre de Lisbonne, directly and explicitly confronted the philosophical challenge that this catastrophic disaster presented to contemporary philosophical optimism, with Voltaire's poem posing pointed and deliberately provocative rhetorical questions regarding how philosophers who insisted that all apparent evil within the world ultimately served some greater rational and providential purpose could possibly explain or justify the specific and catastrophic suffering that the Lisbon earthquake had inflicted upon its largely innocent civilian population, including considerable numbers of women, children, and devout religious worshippers who had, by any reasonable contemporary moral standard, done nothing whatsoever to deserve the catastrophic suffering that this natural disaster had inflicted upon them. This poem generated immediate and considerable contemporary philosophical and theological controversy, with several contemporary philosophers and theologians, including most prominently the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, publishing direct and extensive subsequent responses specifically engaging with and specifically contesting various aspects of Voltaire's philosophical argument, with Rousseau's own subsequent published response specifically arguing that much of the Lisbon earthquake's catastrophic human toll resulted not from any inherent and irreducible evil within the natural world itself, but rather from specific human choices, including the choice to construct a densely populated urban city featuring tall multi-story buildings concentrated within a geologically vulnerable location. Choices that Rousseau argued represented a form of avoidable human responsibility for at least a substantial portion of the disaster's catastrophic human toll, rather than representing purely and exclusively the kind of unavoidable natural evil that Voltaire's poem had more directly emphasized. Voltaire's subsequent and considerably more famous satirical novel Candide, published several years after the earthquake itself in 1759, extended and considerably developed this philosophical critique through its sustained satirical narrative, following its central characters, including most prominently the relentlessly and absurdly optimistic philosophical tutor Pangloss, through an escalating sequence of increasingly catastrophic misfortunes, including, in one direct and explicit textual reference, the character's own fictional experience of surviving the actual historical Lisbon earthquake itself, with Pangloss's persistent and increasingly absurd insistence, throughout these accumulating catastrophes, that they nonetheless continue to inhabit the best of all possible worlds, representing Voltaire's sustained and deliberately satirical literary device for exposing what he considered to be the genuine philosophical inadequacy and genuine moral callousness of unreflective philosophical optimism when confronted with the actual scale and actual severity of genuine human suffering and genuine historical catastrophe. This sustained literary and philosophical engagement, extending from Voltaire's immediate poetic response through his considerably more developed and considerably more influential subsequent satirical novel, represents one of the more historically significant and most enduringly influential examples of how a specific historical natural disaster can directly motivate major subsequent literary and philosophical production, with Candide specifically continuing to be widely read, widely taught, and widely discussed within contemporary literary and philosophical education more than 2.5 centuries after its original publication, ensuring that the Lisbon earthquake's specific philosophical and literary legacy has continued to reach and to influence subsequent generations of readers and subsequent generations of philosophical and literary scholars considerably beyond the specific 18th century historical context within which this catastrophic natural disaster originally occurred. The theological and religious responses that the Lisbon earthquake generated within contemporary European religious and theological discourse represent another genuinely significant dimension of this disaster's broader intellectual and cultural consequences, connecting this catastrophic natural event to broader contemporary debates regarding divine providence, divine punishment, and the proper theological interpretation of major natural disasters. Several contemporary religious commentators, working within various different European religious and theological traditions, interpreted the Lisbon earthquake as representing a form of divine punishment or divine judgment, with various specific theological arguments proposed regarding exactly what particular sins or particular moral and religious failings the earthquake might represent divine punishment for, including, in some particularly historically significant instances, explicitly anti-Catholic theological interpretations proposed by certain contemporary Protestant commentators who specifically argued that the earthquake represented divine punishment for what they characterized as Catholic religious practices and Catholic religious institutions that they considered theologically illegitimate or morally corrupt, theological interpretations that, whatever their own internal theological coherence within the specific contemporary religious traditions that proposed them, illustrate how this catastrophic natural disaster became entangled within broader and already well-established contemporary religious and sectarian controversies extending considerably beyond the specific natural disaster itself. The specific and historically poignant detail that the earthquake struck with particular destructive severity precisely those churches filled with devout worshippers engaged in pious religious observance for the All Saints' Day holiday, while reportedly causing comparatively less severe destruction within certain less religiously significant areas of the city, presented a particularly difficult interpretive challenge for theological frameworks that wished to interpret the disaster as representing some form of coherent and morally comprehensible divine punishment specifically targeting moral or religious failing, since the disaster's documented pattern of destruction did not, by most contemporary accounts, appear to correlate in any clearly discernible way with any plausible pattern of differential moral or religious culpability among the specific individuals and specific institutions that the earthquake's destruction affected. Contemporary Portuguese religious and ecclesiastical authorities, including senior figures within the Portuguese Catholic Church, generally adopted somewhat more theologically cautious and somewhat more pastorally oriented interpretive frameworks in their own contemporary public responses to the disaster, generally emphasizing themes of divine mystery, the limits of human theological understanding regarding the specific reasons for particular instances of divine providence, and the importance of continued faith and continued religious devotion in the face of catastrophic and humanly incomprehensible suffering, rather than advancing the kind of more specific and more confidently asserted theological claims regarding particular sins or particular moral failings that some other contemporary commentators, working from somewhat different theological and sectarian perspectives, more confidently advanced. This considerable range of contemporary theological and religious interpretive responses to the Lisbon earthquake, extending from confident claims regarding specific divine punishment for specific moral or sectarian failings through to considerably more cautious theological emphasis on divine mystery and the limits of human theological understanding, illustrates the genuinely significant and genuinely contested theological and religious discourse that this catastrophic natural disaster generated across considerable portions of contemporary European religious and intellectual culture, discourse that connected this specific Portuguese natural disaster to broader and already well-established contemporary theological debates regarding the proper relationship between divine providence, natural catastrophe, and human moral responsibility that had already been actively developing within European religious and philosophical thought across the preceding decades and centuries. The scientific and proto-scientific response to the Lisbon earthquake, including the systematic data collection effort that Pombal's government organized in the disaster's immediate aftermath, represents an historically significant early example of organized empirical natural disaster investigation, connecting this catastrophic event to the broader development of seismology as a subsequent recognized scientific discipline. Pombal's government, in addition to its more immediately practical disaster response and subsequent urban reconstruction efforts, organized a systematic survey effort, distributing a detailed questionnaire to religious and civil authorities across Portugal specifically requesting detailed observational information regarding the earthquake's specific local effects, including questions addressing the earthquake's specific timing, its specific duration, its specific direction of ground shaking, and various other specific observational details regarding the earthquake's local manifestation and local consequences across the considerable range of Portuguese towns and regions that this systematic survey effort was able to reach. This systematic empirical data collection effort, while obviously conducted using methodology considerably less rigorous and considerably less standardized than the kind of systematic scientific data collection methodology that subsequent seismological research would eventually develop, nonetheless represents what several historians of science have specifically recognized as one of the earlier historically significant examples of organized empirical investigation specifically directed toward understanding a major natural disaster's specific physical characteristics and specific geographic pattern of effects, with a considerable body of surviving response data that this survey effort generated subsequently providing valuable historical evidence that modern seismologists have drawn upon in their own subsequent efforts to reconstruct this historical earthquake's specific magnitude, specific epicenter location, and specific pattern of geographic effects. Contemporary natural philosophers and contemporary scientific commentators across Europe, beyond the specific Portuguese governmental investigation effort, also engaged extensively with the earthquake as a subject of considerable scientific interest and considerable scientific speculation, with various contemporary scientific publications proposing various theoretical explanations for the earthquake's underlying physical causes, theoretical explanations that, reflecting the considerably more limited state of contemporary geological and seismological scientific understanding available during this historical period, generally proved considerably less accurate than the considerably more sophisticated subsequent scientific understanding that 20th and 21st century seismological research would eventually develop, but that nonetheless reflect a genuine and historically significant contemporary scientific engagement with this catastrophic natural disaster as a subject, warranting serious scientific investigation and serious scientific theoretical explanation, rather than simply representing a subject suitable only for theological or philosophical interpretation. This combination of organized governmental empirical data collection and broader contemporary scientific theoretical engagement illustrates how the Lisbon earthquake, beyond its more frequently discussed philosophical and theological consequences, also occupies a historically significant position within the broader development of natural disaster science and within the broader development of what would eventually become the modern scientific discipline of seismology, connecting this catastrophic 18th-century natural disaster to the considerably more methodologically developed contemporary scientific field that subsequent generations of researchers would eventually establish for the systematic study of earthquakes and their underlying geological causes. Marquis of Pombal's broader political career and broader political influence within subsequent 18th-century Portuguese governmental history, extending considerably beyond his specific disaster response and reconstruction efforts immediately following the 1755 earthquake, represents an important dimension of this disaster's broader historical and political significance that connects the earthquake to subsequent and genuinely significant developments within Portuguese political and administrative history. Pombal's effective and widely praised disaster response and subsequent reconstruction direction substantially enhanced his personal political standing and personal political influence within the Portuguese royal government, contributing significantly to his subsequent emergence as the dominant and effectively unchallenged figure within Portuguese governmental policy for the remainder of King José I's reign, a period during which Pombal implemented a considerable range of significant administrative, economic, and religious policy reforms extending well beyond the specific earthquake reconstruction effort that had originally enhanced his political standing. These broader Pombaline reforms, as historians of Portuguese history generally refer to this considerable body of policy change implemented under Pombal's dominant political direction, included significant economic policy reforms intended to reduce Portugal's economic dependence on British trade and British commercial interests, significant educational policy reforms intended to modernize and to expand Portuguese educational institutions along lines reflecting broader contemporary European Enlightenment intellectual influences, and, perhaps most historically significantly and most historically controversially, the expulsion of the Jesuit religious order from Portugal and from Portuguese colonial territories, a major and genuinely consequential policy action that historians have connected to Pombal's broader and genuinely significant effort to reduce what he considered to be excessive and inappropriate Jesuit political and economic influence within Portuguese governmental and colonial administration. The specific historical relationship between Pombal's effective earthquake disaster response, which substantially enhanced his personal political standing and personal political authority, and his subsequent ability to implement this considerable range of significant and often genuinely controversial broader policy reforms, illustrates an important and genuinely significant pattern that historians studying the broader political consequences of major natural disasters have specifically examined. The way that effective and widely praised crisis disaster response can substantially enhance an individual political figure's personal political authority and personal political capital. Authority and capital that such figures can subsequently apply toward the implementation of broader policy agendas extending well beyond the specific immediate disaster response that originally generated this enhanced political standing, a pattern that connects the specific historical case of Pombal and the 1755 Lisbon earthquake to a considerably broader body of subsequent historical and political science research examining the general relationship between crisis disaster response and subsequent political authority and subsequent policy reform capacity more generally. Economic consequences that the Lisbon earthquake produced for Portugal and for Portugal's broader colonial empire represent another genuinely significant dimension of this disaster's historical impact, extending considerably beyond the immediate physical destruction and immediate human mortality that this documentary has already discussed in considerable detail. The earthquake's catastrophic destruction of considerable portions of central Lisbon's commercial infrastructure, including warehouses, shops, and other commercial facilities containing substantial quantities of valuable trade goods, including considerable quantities of goods connected to Portugal's substantial colonial trade with Brazil and with Portugal's other colonial territories, produced significant immediate economic losses that historians studying the disaster's broader economic consequences have estimated as representing a very substantial proportion of Portugal's overall contemporary national economic wealth, losses that, when combined with the very substantial subsequent reconstruction costs that the city's considerable rebuilding effort required, placed significant and sustained strain on Portuguese governmental finances across the subsequent years and decades following the disaster. This significant economic strain contributed to and reinforced several of the broader economic policy reforms that Pombal subsequently implemented as part of his broader governmental reform agenda, including specific policy measures intended to increase Portuguese governmental revenue and specific policy measures intended to reduce certain categories of Portuguese governmental expenditure, with historians studying Pombal's broader economic policy program specifically connecting at least some elements of this broader economic reform agenda to the genuine and substantial fiscal pressure that the earthquake's catastrophic economic costs had placed upon Portuguese governmental finances. The earthquake's broader economic consequences also extended to Portugal's important and economically significant commercial relationship with England, a relationship that had been formalized through several earlier treaty agreements establishing preferential trading arrangements between the two countries, with English merchants and English commercial interests operating within Lisbon experiencing substantial direct economic losses connected to the earthquake's destruction, and with the English government itself providing some direct financial and material disaster relief assistance to Portugal in the disaster's immediate aftermath. Assistance that historians studying this specific bilateral diplomatic relationship have examined as an interesting historical example of contemporary international disaster relief and contemporary international diplomatic relations operating in connection with a major natural disaster occurring within a country maintaining a significant ongoing commercial and diplomatic relationship with the providing nation. This combination of substantial immediate economic loss, substantial subsequent reconstruction cost, and broader subsequent economic policy consequence illustrates how the Lisbon earthquake's historical significance extends considerably beyond its more frequently discussed philosophical and theological consequences to encompass genuinely significant and genuinely substantial economic and fiscal consequences that shaped Portuguese governmental policy and Portuguese international economic relationships across the considerable subsequent period following this catastrophic disaster's original 1755 occurrence. Architectural and engineering innovations that emerged from Lisbon's post-earthquake reconstruction effort, particularly the distinctive Pombaline cage construction system discussed previously, represent a genuinely significant contribution to the broader subsequent historical development of earthquake-resistant architectural and engineering design, connecting this specific 18th-century Portuguese disaster to subsequent and considerably more developed contemporary engineering approaches. To seismic hazard mitigation. The Pombaline cage construction system, involving a distinctive internal timber framework designed to provide structural flexibility and structural resilience during seismic ground shaking, while still incorporating the masonry exterior wall construction that contemporary architectural and aesthetic conventions generally required for buildings of this type and this historical period, represented a genuinely innovative engineering solution to the specific structural engineering challenge that the 1755 earthquake had so dramatically demonstrated regarding the catastrophic vulnerability of conventional contemporary masonry construction methods to severe seismic ground shaking. Subsequent structural engineering research and subsequent historical architectural research studying surviving examples of Pombaline cage construction buildings within Lisbon's reconstructed Central District has confirmed that this distinctive construction system did indeed provide genuinely improved structural resilience during subsequent seismic events that have affected the Lisbon region across the considerable period since the original 18th century reconstruction, with several surviving Pombaline buildings having successfully withstood subsequent moderate seismic events that have affected the city without experiencing the kind of catastrophic structural failure that comparable conventional masonry construction, lacking this specific internal timber framework reinforcement, would likely have experienced under comparable seismic loading conditions. This specific historical engineering innovation, emerging directly from the practical engineering challenge that the catastrophic 1755 earthquake had so dramatically demonstrated, represents what several historians of engineering have specifically recognized as an important early historical example of deliberately earthquake-resistant structural engineering design, contributing to a broader historical narrative connecting this specific 18th-century Portuguese engineering innovation to the considerably more sophisticated and considerably more scientifically grounded contemporary structural engineering approaches to seismic hazard mitigation that subsequent generations of structural engineers, working with considerably more advanced scientific understanding of seismic ground motion and considerably more advanced structural engineering analytical and computational tools, have subsequently developed and continue to refine within contemporary earthquake-resistant building design and contemporary earthquake-resistant urban planning practice across the considerable number of contemporary cities and contemporary regions around the world that continue to face genuine and significant ongoing seismic hazard risk. European intellectual and cultural reception of the Lisbon earthquake, extending beyond the more specifically philosophical engagement that Voltaire's literary work exemplifies, illustrates the genuinely widespread and genuinely significant contemporary European cultural attention that this catastrophic disaster generated across a considerable range of different intellectual, artistic, and cultural domains. Contemporary European newspapers and contemporary periodical publications provided extensive coverage of the disaster, drawing on the considerably developed contemporary European postal and communication networks that, while obviously considerably less rapid than the later 19th-century telegraph communication infrastructure discussed in connection with the considerably later Krakatoa eruption, nonetheless allowed news of this catastrophic disaster to reach considerable portions of the broader European reading public within a time frame of weeks rather than months, generating considerable contemporary public interest and considerable contemporary public discussion regarding this disaster's scale and this disaster's broader significance across considerable portions of contemporary European society, extending well beyond the more specifically elite philosophical and intellectual circles that subsequently engaged with the disaster's more specifically philosophical implications. Contemporary visual artists across Europe produced numerous artistic representations of the earthquake and its catastrophic destruction, with various contemporary engravings and contemporary paintings depicting the earthquake's destruction, the subsequent tsunami, and the subsequent fire achieving considerable contemporary popular circulation and considerable contemporary popular attention, contributing to a broader visual and popular cultural awareness of this disaster's catastrophic scale that complemented and reinforced the more specifically textual and more specifically philosophical engagement with the disaster that contemporary intellectual figures including Voltaire and Rousseau more specifically exemplified. The earthquake's broader cultural and intellectual reception also connected to broader contemporary European debates regarding the proper relationship between urban planning, architectural design, and natural disaster risk, with the earthquake's catastrophic urban destruction motivating broader contemporary European discussion regarding appropriate urban planning and appropriate architectural design principles for cities facing genuine seismic hazard risk, discussion that, while obviously most immediately and most directly relevant to Lisbon's own specific subsequent reconstruction effort, also contributed to broader contemporary European intellectual engagement with questions of urban planning, architectural design, and natural disaster risk management that extended considerably beyond the specific Portuguese context within which this particular catastrophic disaster had originally occurred. This combination of extensive contemporary news coverage, extensive contemporary visual and artistic representation, and broader contemporary intellectual engagement with questions of urban planning and natural disaster risk management illustrates the genuinely widespread and genuinely significant contemporary European cultural and intellectual attention that this catastrophic disaster generated, attention that, while perhaps most enduringly and most influentially exemplified through Voltaire's specific subsequent literary and philosophical engagement with the disaster, nonetheless extended considerably beyond this single most famous example to encompass a genuinely broad range of contemporary European cultural, artistic, and intellectual response and contemporary European cultural, artistic, and intellectual engagement. Subsequent historical and seismological reassessment of the 1755 Lisbon earthquake's precise magnitude and precise underlying geological mechanism, conducted by modern seismologists working with a considerable body of surviving contemporary historical documentation regarding this earthquake's effects, illustrates how contemporary scientific research methodology continues to develop increasingly sophisticated and increasingly precise scientific understanding of even historical earthquakes that occurred well before the development of any direct seismographic instrumentation. Modern seismologists studying this historical earthquake have developed sophisticated methodological approaches for estimating historical earthquake magnitude and historical earthquake epicenter location based on careful systematic analysis of the considerable body of surviving contemporary documentary evidence regarding the earthquake's specific documented effects across the considerable geographic range of locations where contemporary observers documented and recorded their own direct observational experience of this earthquake's local manifestation and local consequences. Methodology that has allowed researchers to develop increasingly precise and increasingly scientifically grounded estimates regarding this historical earthquake's specific magnitude and specific underlying geological characteristics despite the complete absence of any direct contemporary seismographic instrumental recording. This kind of historical seismological reconstruction research has continued to develop and to refine across the considerable decades of subsequent seismological research addressing this specific historical earthquake, with researchers continuing to apply increasingly sophisticated analytical methodology and increasingly comprehensive historical documentary evidence to continue refining scientific understanding regarding this earthquake's precise underlying geological characteristics, work that connects this historical 18th century natural disaster to ongoing and genuinely active contemporary seismological research addressing the broader scientific challenge of historical earthquake reconstruction and historical seismic hazard assessment more generally. The specific contemporary scientific and policy significance that this historical seismological reconstruction work holds for contemporary seismic hazard assessment within the broader Iberian Peninsula region and broader North Atlantic region more generally reflects the genuinely important practical scientific value that improved historical understanding of this major historical earthquake provides for contemporary efforts to assess the genuine ongoing seismic hazard risk that this geologically complex region continues to represent for its considerable contemporary population. Work that connects this historical 18th century catastrophe directly to ongoing contemporary scientific research and ongoing contemporary natural disaster risk management policy specifically focused on better understanding and better preparing for the genuine possibility of future major seismic events occurring within this historically demonstrated and historically significant seismic hazard zone. This continuing scientific engagement with the historical 1755 Lisbon earthquake illustrates how even natural disasters occurring well before the development of any direct scientific instrumentation can continue to generate genuinely valuable and genuinely actively developing contemporary scientific research. With each methodological advance in historical seismological reconstruction technique continuing to deepen and to refine contemporary scientific understanding of this historically significant and historically catastrophic natural disaster. Comparison between the Lisbon earthquake's broader philosophical and intellectual consequences and the broader philosophical and intellectual consequences that other major historical natural disasters this documentary series has previously examined have generated provides an interesting and genuinely informative comparative perspective regarding the varying ways that major historical catastrophes can generate sustained subsequent intellectual and philosophical engagement. Unlike the considerably more narrowly scientific and considerably more narrowly historical subsequent engagement that several other major historical natural disasters this documentary series has previously examined have generated, the Lisbon earthquake's specific and historically distinctive connection to one of the central philosophical debates of the entire 18th century European Enlightenment, regarding the proper philosophical and theological understanding of the relationship between divine providence, rational cosmic order, and the genuine reality of human suffering, gave this specific historical disaster a genuinely distinctive and genuinely significant position within the broader subsequent history of Western philosophical thought that few, if any, other major historical natural disasters have achieved to a comparable degree. This distinctive philosophical significance connects to a broader pattern that intellectual historians have specifically examined regarding how major historical catastrophes occurring at particularly significant moments within the broader development of contemporary intellectual and philosophical culture can generate disproportionately significant and disproportionately enduring subsequent intellectual engagement compared to catastrophes of potentially comparable or even greater raw physical scale and raw human mortality that happen to occur during periods when contemporary intellectual culture is less specifically primed, through the particular contemporary state of ongoing philosophical and theological debate, to engage with that specific catastrophe's potential broader philosophical and theological implications in quite the same sustained and quite the same historically significant way. The specific and historically enduring literary legacy that Voltaire's Candide specifically represents, continuing to be widely read, widely taught, and widely discussed within contemporary literary and philosophical education more than 2.5 centuries after its original publication, illustrates how this specific philosophical and literary engagement with the Lisbon earthquake's broader implications has achieved a genuinely distinctive and genuinely enduring position within subsequent Western literary and philosophical culture, a position that connects this specific historical natural disaster directly to ongoing contemporary literary and philosophical education and ongoing contemporary literary and philosophical discussion in a way that few, if any, other major historical natural disasters have achieved to a remotely comparable degree. This comparative perspective, examining the Lisbon earthquake's distinctive philosophical and literary legacy alongside the somewhat different patterns of subsequent intellectual engagement that other major historical natural disasters have generated, illustrates the genuinely complex and genuinely variable ways that major historical catastrophes can generate subsequent intellectual, philosophical, and cultural engagement with the specific historical timing, the specific contemporary intellectual context, and the specific subsequent literary and philosophical engagement that particular influential contemporary intellectual figures choose to provide, all playing genuinely significant roles in determining which major historical disasters achieve the kind of distinctive and enduring subsequent intellectual and philosophical significance that the Lisbon earthquake has so clearly and so distinctively achieved. Contemporary seismic hazard that the Lisbon region and the broader Iberian Peninsula continue to represent, connecting this historical 18th century catastrophe directly to genuine and ongoing contemporary natural disaster risk concerns, illustrates the continuing practical significance that careful historical study of this major historical earthquake holds for contemporary seismic hazard assessment and contemporary seismic hazard mitigation policy. Contemporary seismologists studying the broader geological region responsible for generating the 1755 Lisbon earthquake have confirmed that this same broader geological setting continues to represent an active and genuinely significant ongoing seismic hazard zone, with the same broader tectonic forces that generated the catastrophic 1755 earthquake continuing to operate within this geologically complex region in the contemporary present, meaning that the genuine possibility of a future major earthquake occurring within this same broader geological region, potentially affecting Lisbon and other considerable contemporary population centers across Portugal, Spain, and North Africa, represents a genuine and scientifically well-grounded contemporary natural disaster risk that contemporary seismic hazard assessment and contemporary seismic hazard mitigation policy must continue to take seriously. Contemporary Portuguese governmental authorities, working in coordination with international seismological research institutions and international natural disaster risk management organizations, maintain ongoing seismic monitoring infrastructure and ongoing seismic hazard assessment research specifically focused on this region, including ongoing research specifically intended to improve scientific understanding of this region's specific seismic hazard characteristics and ongoing policy development specifically intended to improve contemporary Lisbon's structural and infrastructural resilience to the genuine possibility of a future major seismic event comparable in scale to the historical 1755 catastrophe. The specific contemporary building codes and contemporary structural engineering standards that Portugal currently maintains for new construction within Lisbon and within other seismically vulnerable Portuguese regions reflect, in part, the considerable historical lesson that the 1755 earthquake's catastrophic structural destruction so dramatically demonstrated, with contemporary Portuguese seismic building codes specifically requiring structural engineering design features intended to provide genuine seismic resilience considerably more sophisticated and considerably more scientifically grounded than even the historically innovative Pombaline cage construction system that Pombal's 18th-century reconstruction effort originally pioneered, reflecting the considerable subsequent development that structural engineering science and structural engineering practice have undergone across the more than 2.5 centuries since the original catastrophic 1755 disaster. This ongoing and genuinely practical contemporary scientific and policy engagement with the continuing seismic hazard that the Lisbon region represents illustrates how the historical study of this 18th-century natural disaster continues to inform genuinely consequential contemporary natural disaster risk management policy and genuinely consequential contemporary structural engineering practice. Connecting the historical catastrophe this documentary has examined directly to ongoing contemporary efforts specifically focused on protecting present-day Lisbon's considerable contemporary population from the continuing and scientifically well-documented seismic risk that this historically demonstrated and continuing to be geologically active region continues to represent. Question of how the Lisbon earthquake's broader philosophical legacy connects to subsequent and considerably more contemporary philosophical and theological discussions regarding what philosophers and theologians generally refer to as the problem of evil. The broader philosophical and theological challenge of reconciling the existence of genuine suffering and genuine evil within the world with various philosophical and theological claims regarding divine benevolence, divine omnipotence, or broader cosmic rational order, illustrates the continuing philosophical relevance that this historical 18th-century catastrophe holds for ongoing contemporary philosophical and theological discussion. Contemporary philosophers and contemporary theologians continuing to engage with the broader philosophical problem of evil frequently reference the historical Lisbon earthquake as a particularly clear and particularly historically significant illustrative example of what philosophers specifically describe as natural evil, suffering and destruction resulting from natural processes rather than from any specific human moral agency or human moral choice, a category of evil that philosophers studying the broader problem of evil have specifically distinguished from what they describe as moral evil, suffering resulting from specific human moral choices and specific human moral agency, with the Lisbon earthquake continuing to serve as one of the more frequently cited historical illustrative examples within contemporary academic, philosophical, and theological discussion specifically addressing this particular category of natural evil and its broader philosophical and theological implications. This continuing philosophical and theological reference to the Lisbon earthquake within contemporary academic discussion of the broader problem of evil illustrates how this specific historical catastrophe has achieved a genuinely distinctive and genuinely enduring position within the broader subsequent history of Western philosophical and theological thought, with the earthquake continuing to serve, more than 2.5 centuries after its original occurrence, as a specifically referenced historical case study and specifically referenced historical illustrative example within ongoing contemporary academic, philosophical, and theological discussion and ongoing contemporary academic, philosophical, and theological scholarship, a continuing philosophical relevance that connects this historical 18th century natural disaster directly to ongoing contemporary academic, philosophical, and theological research and ongoing contemporary academic, philosophical, and theological education. The specific and broader question of whether major historical natural disasters genuinely possess the capacity to produce lasting and genuinely significant shifts in broader societal, philosophical, and theological understanding, as the considerable subsequent historical and philosophical literature addressing the Lisbon earthquake's broader intellectual consequences has frequently suggested regarding this specific historical case, or whether such disasters instead primarily serve to accelerate and to crystallize broader intellectual and philosophical shifts that were already developing within contemporary intellectual culture for reasons substantially independent of any specific catastrophic natural disaster, represents a genuinely significant and genuinely actively debated question within the broader academic field of intellectual history, a debate to which the specific historical case of the Lisbon earthquake and its documented subsequent philosophical and theological consequences continues to provide one of the more frequently cited and more frequently analyzed historical case studies within this broader and continuing scholarly discussion. Individual human experiences and individual human stories connected to the Lisbon earthquake, documented through the considerable body of surviving contemporary accounts and subsequent historical research, provide an essential human dimension to this broader historical, philosophical, and scientific narrative that complements and enriches the more abstract philosophical and scientific evidence this documentary has primarily examined throughout its preceding discussion. Contemporary survivor accounts describe genuinely harrowing personal experiences during the earthquake's initial catastrophic ground shaking, including documented accounts of individuals trapped within partially collapsed buildings, documented accounts of families separated amid the chaos and confusion of the earthquake's immediate aftermath, and documented accounts of the particular terror that contemporary observers experienced as they witnessed the city's most significant and most architecturally impressive buildings, including numerous churches and palaces that had stood for generations as symbols of the city's considerable wealth and considerable cultural achievement, collapsing within the span of just a few catastrophic minutes. The specific experience of the considerable numbers of religious worshippers who had gathered within Lisbon's churches for All Saints' Day religious observance at the precise moment the earthquake struck represents a particularly poignant and particularly historically significant dimension of this disaster's human toll, with surviving contemporary accounts describing the particular horror that these worshippers experienced as the very religious buildings within which they had gathered, specifically to engage in pious religious devotion, began collapsing directly upon them, a tragic circumstance that contemporary religious and philosophical commentators specifically cited, as discussed previously, as presenting a particularly difficult interpretive challenge for theological frameworks attempting to understand this catastrophic disaster as representing some form of coherent and morally comprehensible divine judgment or divine punishment. The specific subsequent experience of the considerable numbers of disaster survivors who faced the difficult and often genuinely traumatic task of searching for missing family members amid the catastrophic destruction, of attempting to recover whatever personal possessions and whatever personal property might have survived the combined destruction of the earthquake, the tsunami, and the subsequent fire, and of attempting to rebuild their lives and their livelihoods within a city that had, within the span of less than a single week, lost the overwhelming majority of its built environment and a very substantial proportion of its total population, represents the genuine and considerable human cost that underlies the broader historical, philosophical, and scientific narrative that this documentary has primarily examined. A human cost that the considerable subsequent philosophical and intellectual engagement with this disaster's broader implications, however historically significant, and however genuinely important in its own right, should not be allowed to entirely overshadow or entirely obscure. These varied individual human accounts, documenting both the immediate terror and immediate trauma that this catastrophic disaster produced and the considerable subsequent human resilience and considerable subsequent human effort that Lisbon's surviving population demonstrated in the difficult years of reconstruction and recovery that followed. Provide an essential human dimension that connects the more abstract philosophical, theological, and scientific dimensions of this catastrophic disaster's broader historical significance to the genuine and considerable human suffering and the genuine and considerable human resilience that this disaster actually produced among the specific individuals and specific families who directly experienced its catastrophic consequences. How the Lisbon earthquake connects to the broader subsequent historical development of what historians of science generally recognize as the modern scientific discipline of seismology represents an important dimension of this disaster's broader scientific legacy, extending considerably beyond the specific 18th century scientific and proto-scientific engagement that this documentary has already discussed. Historians of science studying the broader subsequent development of seismology as a recognized scientific discipline have specifically identified the Lisbon earthquake, and particularly Pombal's organized systematic survey effort discussed previously, as representing an important and historically significant early precedent for the kind of systematic empirical natural disaster investigation that would eventually develop into the considerably more methodologically sophisticated and considerably more scientifically rigorous discipline of modern seismology, a discipline that would not achieve full scientific maturity, including the development of reliable seismographic instrumentation and the development of rigorous quantitative earthquake magnitude measurement methodology, until considerably later in the 19th and 20th centuries. This historical connection between the Lisbon earthquake's organized contemporary scientific investigation and the considerably later subsequent development of modern seismology illustrates a broader pattern that historians of science have specifically examined regarding how major historical natural disasters can sometimes motivate genuinely significant early steps toward more systematic and more empirically rigorous scientific investigation of natural phenomena, even when the full scientific and methodological maturity necessary to fully understand and fully explain these phenomena would not develop until considerably later historical periods, with subsequent generations of scientists building upon these earlier and necessarily more limited investigative efforts as part of the broader cumulative historical development of increasingly sophisticated scientific understanding regarding the natural world and its various, sometimes catastrophic natural processes. The specific contemporary academic discipline of historical seismology, the specialized subfield of seismological research specifically focused on reconstructing and analyzing historical earthquakes that occurred before the development of direct seismographic instrumentation, continues to draw extensively upon the considerable body of surviving historical documentary evidence connected to the Lisbon earthquake, with this specific historical earthquake continuing to serve as one of the more frequently studied and more frequently analyzed historical case studies within this specialized contemporary academic research field, illustrating the continuing scientific research value that this historical 18th century catastrophe continues to provide for contemporary seismological research more than 2.5 centuries after its original catastrophic occurrence. This continuing scientific legacy, connecting the Lisbon earthquake's contemporary 18th century scientific investigation to the considerably more methodologically sophisticated contemporary scientific discipline of historical seismology, illustrates how this historical natural disaster, beyond its more frequently discussed philosophical and theological consequences, also occupies a genuinely significant position within the broader historical development of seismology as a recognized scientific discipline, connecting this historical 18th century Portuguese catastrophe to ongoing and genuinely active contemporary scientific research addressing both this specific historical earthquake and the broader scientific challenge of historical earthquake reconstruction and historical seismic hazard assessment more generally. How Lisbon's catastrophic destruction and subsequent reconstruction connects to broader contemporary and subsequent historical discussions regarding the relationship between major natural disasters and broader patterns of subsequent urban planning and subsequent urban development represents another genuinely significant dimension of this disaster's broader historical legacy. Historians of urban planning have specifically examined Lisbon's post-earthquake reconstruction, discussed previously in connection with Pombal's direction of this considerable reconstruction effort, as representing one of the more historically significant and most frequently studied examples of comprehensive and centrally planned urban reconstruction following a major disaster, with this specific historical case study continuing to inform broader contemporary academic and professional discussion regarding the genuine opportunities and the genuine challenges that major urban disasters can present for implementing comprehensive urban planning reform that might prove considerably more difficult to implement within an existing and already developed urban environment lacking the kind of dramatic and comprehensive physical destruction that creates genuine opportunity for this type of large-scale, comprehensive urban redevelopment. This specific historical pattern, in which a catastrophic natural disaster's comprehensive physical destruction creates genuine opportunity for implementing comprehensive urban planning reform that proves considerably more difficult to achieve within existing developed urban environments, connects to a considerably broader body of subsequent historical and urban planning research examining comparable patterns within other major historical urban disasters, including, to cite one frequently discussed comparative example, the considerable urban planning reform that followed the catastrophic Great Fire of London in 1666, an earlier historical disaster that this documentary series will examine in considerably greater detail within a subsequent dedicated film, with researchers studying these comparative historical examples specifically examining the broader pattern regarding how major urban disasters can sometimes serve as genuine catalysts for implementing urban planning and urban infrastructure reforms that contemporary urban planning advocates might have struggled to implement absent the kind of dramatic physical destruction and dramatic political opportunity that a major urban disaster of this catastrophic scale can sometimes create. The specific and genuinely significant earthquake-resistant structural engineering innovations that Lisbon's specific post-earthquake reconstruction effort incorporated, discussed previously in connection with the distinctive Pombaline cage construction system, represents a particularly significant example of this broader pattern, illustrating how the specific and catastrophic structural engineering failures that a major natural disaster so dramatically demonstrates can sometimes motivate genuinely significant subsequent engineering innovation that might have proven considerably more difficult to motivate and considerably more difficult to implement absent the kind of dramatic and catastrophic demonstration of existing structural engineering inadequacy that the disaster itself provides. This broader historical and urban planning research connecting Lisbon's specific post-earthquake reconstruction experience to comparable patterns observed within other major historical urban disasters illustrates how this specific 18th-century Portuguese catastrophe continues to inform broader contemporary academic and professional discussion regarding the genuine and complex relationship between major urban disasters and subsequent urban planning reform, connecting this historical catastrophe to ongoing and genuinely active contemporary scholarly research addressing the broader historical and contemporary relationship between natural disaster, urban destruction, and subsequent urban planning and urban development opportunity. Contemporary commemorative and historical memory practices connected to the Lisbon earthquake, including the various contemporary monuments, contemporary museums, and contemporary historical educational programs that contemporary Portuguese institutions maintain specifically addressing this historical catastrophe, illustrate the continuing contemporary historical and cultural significance that this disaster continues to hold within contemporary Portuguese national historical memory and contemporary Portuguese national historical identity. Contemporary Lisbon maintains several specific historical sites and historical monuments connected to the earthquake and its aftermath, including preserved ruins of certain churches that were destroyed during the earthquake and subsequently left in their ruined state as deliberate historical monuments and deliberate historical memorials, rather than being either fully demolished or fully reconstructed. providing contemporary visitors and contemporary Lisbon residents with direct physical and visual access to tangible historical evidence of this catastrophic disaster's destructive impact, evidence that continues to occupy a visually and physically prominent position within the contemporary city's broader historical and architectural landscape. The Pombaline Reconstruction District itself, discussed previously in connection with its distinctive grid street pattern and distinctive earthquake-resistant architectural design, continues to function as a significant and actively used contemporary commercial and residential district within central Lisbon, representing a particularly significant example of how this historical disaster's reconstruction legacy continues to shape the contemporary lived urban experience of considerable numbers of contemporary Lisbon residents and considerable numbers of contemporary Lisbon visitors who continue to inhabit, to work within, and to visit this historically significant reconstructed urban district on a continuing daily basis. Contemporary Portuguese educational curricula and contemporary Portuguese historical museums maintain considerable ongoing educational attention to the Lisbon earthquake's historical significance, reflecting this disaster's continuing recognized importance within contemporary Portuguese national historical memory and contemporary Portuguese national historical education, with contemporary Portuguese students continuing to learn about this historical catastrophe and its considerable historical, philosophical, and scientific significance as part of their standard contemporary educational engagement with broader Portuguese national history. This combination of preserved physical historical monuments, continuing contemporary urban use of the historically significant Pombaline Reconstruction District, and continuing contemporary educational and museum attention to this disaster's historical significance illustrates the genuine and continuing contemporary historical and cultural importance that the Lisbon earthquake continues to hold within contemporary Portuguese national historical memory and contemporary Portuguese national historical identity, connecting this historical 18th century catastrophe directly to the continuing contemporary historical consciousness and continuing contemporary historical education of contemporary Portuguese society more than 2.5 centuries after its original catastrophic occurrence. The central image that emerges from this full historical, scientific, and philosophical reconstruction of the Lisbon earthquake is one of a catastrophic natural disaster whose consequences extended considerably beyond its immediate and genuinely devastating physical destruction and immediate and genuinely catastrophic human mortality, reaching into and genuinely reshaping some of the central philosophical and theological debates that characterized the broader 18th century European Enlightenment. The earthquake's specific and historically poignant timing, striking precisely during All Saints' Day religious observance and destroying numerous churches filled with devout worshippers, created a particularly difficult and particularly historically significant philosophical and theological challenge to contemporary philosophical optimism, a challenge that Voltaire sustained literary and philosophical engagement, extending from his immediate poetic response through his considerably more famous and considerably more enduringly influential subsequent satirical novel Candide, would transform into one of the more historically significant and more enduringly influential literary and philosophical responses to any major natural disaster within the entire subsequent history of Western literature and Western philosophy. The specific and genuinely significant disaster response and subsequent reconstruction effort that the Marquis of Pombal organized and directed, including the historically innovative earthquake-resistant Pombaline cage construction system and the broader comprehensive urban planning reform that this reconstruction effort implemented, illustrates how this catastrophic disaster also generated genuinely significant and genuinely lasting practical engineering and urban planning innovation. Connecting this historical 18th century catastrophe to the considerably more developed contemporary structural engineering and contemporary urban planning approaches to seismic hazard mitigation that subsequent generations of engineers and subsequent generations of urban planners have continued to develop and to refine across the more than 2.5 centuries since this disaster's original catastrophic occurrence. The continuing contemporary seismic hazard that the Lisbon region continues to represent connecting this historical catastrophe directly to genuine and ongoing contemporary natural disaster risk management concerns, alongside the continuing contemporary philosophical and theological relevance that this historical disaster continues to hold within ongoing contemporary academic discussion of the broader problem of evil, illustrates how this single historical natural disaster continues to generate genuinely significant and genuinely multifaceted contemporary scientific, philosophical, and practical engagement extending considerably beyond its own specific 18th century historical context, connecting the catastrophic events of November 1, 1755 directly to ongoing contemporary scientific research, ongoing contemporary philosophical and theological scholarship, and ongoing contemporary natural disaster risk management policy that continues to draw upon and to engage with this historically significant and historically catastrophic natural disasters' considerable and genuinely multifaceted historical legacy. Physical locations and specific museum and archival collections where contemporary visitors and researchers can encounter direct evidence and direct historical documentation connected to the Lisbon earthquake provide meaningful opportunities for tangible engagement with this historically and philosophically significant natural disaster. The ruins of the Convento do Carmo, a church and convent complex that was severely damaged during the earthquake and subsequently left in its ruined state as a deliberate historical monument rather than being fully reconstructed, remains one of contemporary Lisbon's more visited and more historically significant sites specifically connected to the earthquake, providing visitors with direct and visually striking physical access to tangible evidence of the earthquake's catastrophic destructive impact upon the city's considerable pre-earthquake architectural and religious heritage. The Pombaline Reconstruction District, discussed previously, continues to provide visitors with direct physical access to the historically significant architectural and urban planning innovations that emerged from Lisbon's post-earthquake reconstruction effort, including the opportunity to directly observe the distinctive grid street pattern and distinctive standardized building facades that characterize this historically significant reconstructed urban district, along with, in certain specific buildings where appropriate access has been arranged, direct observation of the distinctive Pombaline cage construction system's internal timber framework structure. The Lisbon Earthquake Center and various other contemporary Portuguese museums and contemporary Portuguese historical exhibition spaces maintain dedicated exhibition content specifically addressing the earthquake's historical, scientific, and cultural significance, providing visitors with access to historical artifacts, historical documentation, and contemporary scientific and historical interpretive material specifically addressing this catastrophic disaster's considerable and genuinely multifaceted historical legacy. This combination of preserved physical ruins, continuing contemporary use of the historically significant Pombaline Reconstruction District, and dedicated contemporary museum and exhibition content provides genuinely meaningful and genuinely substantial opportunities for direct historical, architectural, and scientific engagement with this catastrophic and historically significant natural disaster, connecting contemporary researchers and contemporary interested members of the public to both the dramatic physical legacy of this earthquake's destruction and reconstruction and the considerable body of historical, scientific, and philosophical scholarship that this catastrophic event has generated across the more than 2.5 centuries since its original occurrence. The ongoing scientific, historical, and philosophical research connected to the Lisbon earthquake continues to develop along multiple active contemporary research directions, as researchers across seismology, history, philosophy, and structural engineering continue to apply new scientific techniques and new categories of available evidence to deepen contemporary understanding of this historically significant catastrophe and its continuing contemporary scientific, philosophical, and practical significance. Continued seismological research building upon the considerable body of surviving historical documentary evidence connected to this earthquake continues to refine scientific understanding of this historical earthquake's specific magnitude, specific epicenter location, and specific underlying geological mechanism. work that connects directly to ongoing contemporary seismic hazard assessment research specifically focused on the broader Iberian Peninsula and broader North Atlantic geological region that this historical earthquake's underlying geological setting represents. Continued historical and philosophical scholarship addressing the earthquake's broader intellectual and cultural consequences, including continued academic research and continued academic publication specifically examining Voltaire's literary and philosophical engagement with this disaster, and continued academic research examining the broader contemporary European theological and philosophical response that this catastrophic disaster generated, continues to develop increasingly nuanced and increasingly comprehensive historical and philosophical understanding of this disaster's considerable broader intellectual significance, building upon the considerable existing body of academic scholarship addressing this specific historical case study. Continued structural engineering research examining the historical Pombaline cage construction systems, specific structural engineering characteristics, and specific structural engineering performance continues to inform contemporary structural engineering research addressing seismic-resistant building design more generally, illustrating how this historical 18th-century engineering innovation continues to provide genuinely valuable historical case study material for contemporary structural engineering research and contemporary structural engineering education. This continuing and genuinely active multidisciplinary scientific, historical, and philosophical research engagement with the Lisbon earthquake, more than 2.5 centuries after the catastrophic 1755 event itself occurred, illustrates how this historically significant natural disaster continues to generate genuinely productive and genuinely evolving scholarly research across multiple academic disciplines, with each new methodological advance and each new category of available evidence, continuing to deepen and to refine contemporary understanding of exactly what happened during this catastrophic disaster and exactly how its consequences, both historical and continuing, have shaped subsequent scientific, philosophical, and practical engineering development across the more than 270 years that have elapsed since this catastrophic earthquake's original occurrence. Tonight, in central Lisbon, the grid streets and standardized facades of the Pombaline Reconstruction District continue to host the daily commercial and residential life of a considerable contemporary population, walking and working within an urban environment whose distinctive form and whose distinctive earthquake-resistant architectural engineering trace their origin directly to the catastrophic morning of November 1, 1755, when the ground beneath the city's previous incarnation shook for what contemporary witnesses experienced as an unbearably long 6 minutes. The earthquake that struck that morning, followed within minutes by a tsunami that drowned those who had fled toward the waterfront seeking safety, and followed within hours by a fire that would burn largely uncontrolled for 5 subsequent days, killed somewhere between 10,000 and 50,000 people according to the considerable range of subsequent historical scholarly mortality estimates, destroyed the overwhelming majority of one of contemporary Europe's wealthiest and most architecturally significant cities, and reached, within months of its original catastrophic occurrence, the desks and the minds of some of the era's most significant European philosophers, who would spend the following years and decades engaged in genuinely significant and genuinely consequential philosophical and theological debate regarding what this catastrophic disaster's apparently arbitrary destruction and apparently arbitrary mortality meant for contemporary philosophical and theological claims regarding the rational and providential order of the universe. What remains, more than 2.5 centuries later, is a body of historical, scientific, and philosophical evidence and historical, scientific, and philosophical scholarship that continues to develop and to deepen. Seismological research continuing to refine scientific understanding of this historical earthquake's specific magnitude and specific underlying geological characteristics. Structural engineering research continuing to examine and to learn from the historically innovative Pombaline cage construction system that Lisbon's post-earthquake reconstruction effort pioneered, and philosophical and literary scholarship continuing to examine and to teach Voltaire's Candide as one of the more enduringly significant literary and philosophical responses to catastrophic human suffering within the entire subsequent history of Western literature and Western philosophy. The earthquake that shook Lisbon for 6 catastrophic minutes on a significant religious holiday morning in 1755 did not simply destroy a city. It generated philosophical and theological debate that would reshape, in genuinely significant and genuinely lasting ways, how considerable portions of educated European society understood the relationship between divine providence, rational cosmic order, and the genuine and irreducible reality of human suffering. A philosophical and intellectual legacy that connects this catastrophic 18th-century natural disaster directly to ongoing contemporary academic, philosophical, and theological discussion more than 2.5 centuries after the ground first began to shake beneath All Saints' Day. Worshippers gathered in Lisbon's now long-vanished churches. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.